I listened to a really interesting podcast this past week, and the speakers were Danielle Hartman, Yossi Klein Halevi, and Dr. Alana Steinheim. And they were talking about what's going on in Israel. And we just experienced quite a week with the recent vote by the Knesset to remove the reasonableness clause, and the counter-protest and the supporting protest. And all of this is taking place on the week of Tisha B'Av. And I think it's one of these weeks that we're going to look back and be like, wow, like the coincidences and how all these things lined up was very unique. One of those moments when we say, wait a second, is there something else going on, right, cosmically, that allowed for all these events to take place? And they summed it up in a beautiful way. They said, we're in the process of reliving two destructions. One, I'm not going to lean into, but I think it's worth noting, and it might capture some emotions for those of us that are following. But I don't necessarily think it's the absolute, I don't agree with it 100%. But the other one really is sitting with me. And the way they captured it was, it said that we've now witnessed, over the course of this week, two temples being destroyed. And one of them, and I'll just put it out there, again, I'm not 100% behind this, but I'll just share what they said, is that the temple of democracy in Israel, that has now been severed. But the other temple that they shared, that used to describe this moment, something that I do want to spend some time talking about this morning, is the temple of the people of Israel. This idea that we are Shevet Achim Gam Yachad, right? We are a tribe of family, and we are together. You just look at the news, hear what's going on from those who are living in Israel, and you get a sense that there's some really deep divisions going on. And lines are being drawn that are at risk of people being afraid to actually cross and venture onto the other side. And all of this is taking place on the week when we commemorate the destruction of the actual temples that stood in Jerusalem. And our tradition teaches us that they were destroyed because of tzinat chinam, because of senseless hatred. So what I want to talk about a little bit is, what do we do with hatred? What do we do with hatred? And I want to sort of ask you your thoughts. What do we do with hatred? And then I'll share with you some commentaries that I heard on the podcast. And then I want to share a couple of my own thoughts about sort of, how do we deal with hatred, which can be very divisive and destructive, and how can we sort of move forward from this moment so that perhaps we don't actually see the destruction of these temples, but it only becomes metaphor. So, what do we do? What do we do with hatred? No. Oh, yeah.
I just saw in the Siddur, at the end of there's a drash story about Aaron,
Mm-hmm.
why we should be like the sons of Aaron. And it says that when two men were struggling,
Yep.
fighting, he would
Yep.
go to one and say, he's so embarrassed and upset
Yeah.
that he's having this fight.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know what to do, and he doesn't
Right.
even know how to approach it. Then he'd go to the other one and say the same thing. And
Yep.
the two of them would go and hug each other. So I guess we should try to be peacemakers. We should try to diminish hatred and strife as much as we can.
Beautiful. We should all be like Aaron. And what I like about that strategy, what that story is highlighting, is how Aaron is actually pointing out a very powerful truth to both combatants, right? Which is they are at the cusp of feeling shame and embarrassment. And oftentimes, when we express hatred towards it leads us to moments of embarrassment and shame. And perhaps Aaron is using to bring everyone together, but even not so deeply. It's important. We should try to bring people together like Aaron. Diana.
I think I too heard a wonderful earlier by Rabbi David Lapin,
Mhm.
who arguably is definitely leans to the right, no doubt.
Mhm.
But what he said is, he goes, enough of the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story, enough of the Sinat Sinam. He says, this isn't baseless hatred. He said, they know exactly what they're fighting for. This isn't some
Yeah.
random, I hate you because I don't know why. They do know. So he harkened back to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash with idolatry, adultery, and murder.
Mhm.
And what did he had things to say about both the idolatry and the adultery, maybe not on the shot level, but certain things that are being worshipped now instead of Torah. But what really struck me was he talked about the murder, and he said, it's character assassination.
Hmm.
And that's where he leaned
Hmm.
into it. He said, this isn't Kamsa Bar
Hmm.
Kamsa anymore. He said, we're past that.
Hmm.
We have to really go into what they're fighting
Hmm.
for, what they're fighting for,
Hmm.
and how passionate they really are.
Mhm.
So my question is then, what do you do with that? I mean, we see the character assassination every single time we turn on some version of the news. That's difficult. That's a virus. That's terrible. So there's both
Yeah.
parts of it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the Sinat Sinam. Well, I heard, there are people that get their news on Instagram, for God's sakes. And it's like, well, then they make these blanket statements because they saw something, a reel on Instagram.
So, you shared a couple of interesting points there, Diana, as always. The first is this beautiful idea that hatred can lead to murder. And it's not necessarily on the level of actually taking a life, although that's been a part of our history as well. But there's this idea of character assassination, right? And that we want to focus our energies, right? And clarify, the intent of our enemies. So perhaps it's not so complicated, right? But it is, we try to simplify, what is going on the other side, which increases barriers even more. Did I capture that first point okay?
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
yeah.
That's what Rabbi Lapin suggests, that it's not as simple as,
Yeah.
Sinat Sinam, let's all hug it out.
The second piece that you shared, and I love this, and this is something that's come up a number of times, is this idea of senseless hatred, right? And we always say in Tisha B'Av, let's get rid of senseless hatred. But the truth is, if you ask anyone, if you ever had a moment of hatred, no one at that moment is like, this is senseless. Like, people only hate if they identify it as being sensible, right? There's the idea like, I know my hatred towards you is senseless. No, like, I actually have a reason for it. I have a sense for there's a purpose. So there is a weakness of that. So maybe it's calling it out and realizing, that hatred is no small thing, and we should be mindful of it. Good. Anyone else? Tom. Hmm. That's beautiful. I think you reiterated to two things. First, you reiterated this idea that hatred is not sensical, right? Of course, if we were to share that to the person, or if we were to hear that when we are feeling a moment of hatred, right, it's very difficult to receive. But then you talked about connecting to someone emotionally. I think a lot of that has to do with listening, right? And this idea of listening to someone that you identify as being nonsensical, but nevertheless making the time to engage in that painful listening because you still want to connect with that person emotionally because they're part of our Shevet, they're part of our tribe. Beautiful. Really, really great. All right, what do we do? What do we do with hatred? Anyone else? Before I allow Nachmanides and Ibn Ezra to lean in on this discussion. Yes? Vote. So I think what you're hinting there is get involved in action, right? Don't let the emotion stifle you, right? But express yourself, right? Move towards making a constructive change. Good. Anyone else? So you're probably wondering, where are the rabbis on this? And I want to highlight that there's not a universal answer here. Right? The hatred is something that our tradition struggles with, and yet we're cursed by it. And perhaps it makes a little bit of sense because we've never been able to completely absolve ourselves as a people, let alone as all of humanity. We've never been able to absolve ourselves of hatred. And there's a beautiful poem that hatred sometimes will be silent, but once it sees an opportunity, it always rises up and gives itself a chance to express itself. So here are some perspectives. One, Nachmanides shares the following piece that, and by the way, the Torah talks about hatred in Leviticus 19. You should not hate your brother in your heart, right? Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. Okay? Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. And what Nachmanides reads this as is, don't hate in your heart. That's what's prohibited, right? So if you hate someone in your heart, say something. Get it out of your system. Say something to them, right? Perhaps you could to this to vote, but I think Nachmanides is also hinting at, if you're feeling something towards someone, you should go out and say it. Get it out. And you're probably thinking, wait a second, that could make matters even worse. He's not concerned about that. He's more concerned about the actual prohibition of living with hatred, which is not, for Nachmanides, a Jewish state to be sitting in. And if I'm sitting with it, therefore I need to talk to someone so I can get my hatred out of my system, but therefore not keep it in. Ibn Ezra comes around and shares something very interesting. His response is that don't even think about talking it out. Just you must expunge it from your heart. If you have hatred, just get rid of it. You can't carry that with you. Right? That very act, when you know you have to do whatever you can to remove that feeling, that mindset from you. And why should we run from hatred so much? Ibn Ezra says this is the cause of the destruction of the temple. When we walk around and when we carry hatred with us, we are leading ourselves to being a part of a community that can lose its temple. And by the way, when we lose the temple, read into that, we lose the right, the privilege, the gift of being sovereign in our home. So for Ibn Ezra, just get out of your system. And not necessarily speaking, just change your mindset so that you're not sitting with hatred. Now I've got one more that I want to share with you. And fasten your seatbelt for this. Because discussion about dealing with enemies in Psachim, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says as follows. Not only is hatred permitted, but it is even a mitzvah to hate your enemy, as it is stated, the fear of God, according to Mishlei, is to hate evil. So here we have an interpretation understood by Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak that says if you encounter, and by the way, Mishlei is just talking about the concept of evil. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak applies that now to a person. There could be an evil person, which is not 100% what Proverbs is saying. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is saying, you know what? If you see an evil person, you are allowed to hate them. Which leads into a little bit about what I've heard earlier about this idea of character assassination. Because when we are able to sense someone as being evil, then of course we have to really build a boundary, and we are allowed to engage in hatred. And before I share some more commentaries, I think we should take a good look at Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, because even though his words make us uncomfortable in a world that's filled with hatred, and as being a part of a people that is really struggling with division, perhaps we're really struggling with the ease of labeling opposition as being evil. And once we do that, we open up the gates to engage in hatred. And I think Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, again, this is a rabbi who witnessed the destruction of the temple, is honestly being real and honest with what it means to be a human being and what it means to deal with things that you love and people that are perhaps that you view as taking away those things that you love. I'm not going to stop there, though, because we have this beautiful parasha that today. We're not going to hear these words today, but we're going to hear the words of ve'ahavta, and you shall love. And most of us know these words by heart. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, right? You should love the Lord your God. And you don't just love, but it says, bechol levavecha, with all of your heart. And when we're reading the Torah portion, you can look at the word levavecha, and you will see that it is spelled with two bets. It should only have one, but it has two. And Rashi reads two bets to say, you should love God with the two parts of your heart. The part of your heart that is the Yetzer Tov, that which seeks good, and the part of your heart that is the Yetzer Hara, that which seeks evil. And what Rashi is admitting is that all of us are capable of doing good and doing evil. All of us are capable of allowing our desire to do good influence us, and all of us are capable of allowing our desire to do evil influence the choices that we make. And what I would say is, if we're all capable of that, then perhaps what we should do is realize that so is everyone else in our own family, in our own community. And that should allow us to realize that yes, evil happens, hatred happens, but so too does a sense of caring and empathy for our other human beings, because we all struggle with those very urges. Last interpretation I want to offer us. There's a great discussion in Exodus that says, what happens when you're walking on the road and you see the ox of your enemy either injured or lost? And Exodus tells us you should take that ox, and you think, what do you do? Well, I'm going to slaughter it, because I'm going to get back at my enemy. I'm going to let my hatred influence it. But no. The Torah says in Exodus, let me find the verses for us. Exodus, it's just such a great verse. I don't want us to, 23:5, here it is. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it with him. So, I'm sorry, the interpretation is your enemy's donkey is injured, and what do you do with it, right? But you help relieve that person's burden so that their animal can be okay. And I propose that we take this verse and allow it to guide the forward. When we look at others, let's imagine that they are lying in the road, struggling between the desire to do good and the desire to do evil. And let's realize that we have the power to aid them in helping them to either come to a greater truth, a greater appreciation of the people of Israel, a joint desire to ensure the long-term presence of a Jewish and democratic state. And together, let's lift up those so that perhaps we no longer have to have suffering. What it requires is not just an empathy that we're all incomplete, but a desire to help and to find strength to lift up. And if we can allow that to guide us, maybe perhaps it'll allow us to move forward, allow us not to be limited by the burden of hatred and anger, and allow us to reach a place where we don't have to be at risk of losing these sacred temples, and rather we can ensure that the land of Israel, its government, and the Jewish democratic presence can remain in Israel for a long time. With that, I say Shabbat Shalom.